Assembled in China. That's what it says on the box of the latest iPhone. But the full story is more complicated. Korean batteries, Japanese cameras, Taiwanese chips, German accelerometers, Congolese minerals, all pieced together in China and sold around the world. The globalization of supply chains has made manufacturing more efficient and consumer goods cheaper. But what happens when a crisis hits? Great Decisions explores the interconnected web of the modern economy, investigates the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on international trade, and asks whether the age of economic globalization might be coming to an end. Global supply chains and national security. Next on Great Decisions.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Herford Foundation, PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
The ferocious spread of COVID-19 in the spring of 2020 caught hospitals unprepared.
I ain't seen nothing like this before in my life.
By April, with supplies dwindling, doctors and nurses around the country were rationing gowns and reusing face masks.
Our index case was March 1st. We knew by March 10th that we were going to be in significant trouble. We did not anticipate the profound disruption of the supply chain from China, where most of these masks came from. And as a consequence of that, we didn't just have a momentary disruption, we had a profound life-threatening disruption in our ability to procure supplies.
Widespread shortages of medical equipment called popular attention to just how much the American medical system relies on international trade.
Countries specialize in different types of equipment. Some of them export a lot of generic medicines like India and China, and protective equipment like masks or garments that help protect the healthcare workers. Those are mostly produced in China and Malaysia.
The pandemic has exacerbated long-standing concerns about how much the American economy relies on supply chains that pass through China.
We're clearly going through a period where people feel very vulnerable, and given the trade tensions with China, the U.S. is very sensitive about being reliant on China for any product or service at this point.
There's a very good reason why people started buying things from China. That was, you could go there and order anything in large quantities and get it relatively quickly. And that will be very difficult and expensive to undo.
Now, policymakers from both parties agree that the federal government must take action to secure critical supply chains.
There is a strong need for us to have reliability in our supply chain so we can take care of our own citizens should there be other health emergencies like this. And sadly, we can predict with near certainty that there will be other health emergencies like this.
Most nations that can will protect fundamental things like food supply, like medicine. Not every nation has that opportunity, but we do in the United States.
The man who changed the global economy forever was a truck driver from North Carolina named Malcolm McLean. In 1956, McLean experimented with a new way to move cargo directly between trucks and ships, stacked efficiently and never needing to be repacked. The modern shipping container was born.
This cargo is going into a steel container called a cargo van. The cargo vans are proving especially useful in the safe shipment of small cargo that's more susceptible to pilferage or damage in handling.
It was actually the evolution and the introduction of the shipping container that fundamentally transformed and lowered by an order of magnitude the cost of shipping and transportation of goods all over the world.
Almost the entire post-war period up until the early 2000s was a golden time for international trade. Deeper engagement in international trade yielded a tremendous growth.
In the 1990s, the digital revolution spurred globalization still further. Increasingly, it was possible to manage far-flung operations over the internet.
The digital revolution created modern global value chains because with computer technologies and the falling costs of communications, it became possible for companies to break up production to maximize both cost efficiency and quality by locating wherever in the world made the most sense.
So for example, Bombardier is a Canadian plane maker, and they make parts of their business jets in central Mexico, and the rest they make in Quebec. And before the internet, there was no way they could make the tails in Mexico and the rest of the plane in Canada and hope they would fit together when you were trying to coordinate this with airmail letters and faxes.
I believe that this pandemic is going to leave us with several lessons. One is that there's greater risk to have all your employees in one place. And number two is you can achieve good efficiency because of the advances in technology, connectivity, use of the web, use of the cloud.
As the 21st century dawned, the patterns of international trade were transformed by the controversial decision to integrate China into the global economy.
In opening the economy of China, the agreement will create unprecedented opportunities for American farmers, workers, and companies.
It's the Democratic caucus of the House of Representatives that voted overwhelmingly against granting most favored nation status to China. At that time, the business interests that were for it said that granting that status would increase our trade deficit by only $1 billion a year. They were off by 30,000%.
Products are made abroad for a reason. It tends to be more efficient to do that, and we benefit enormously as consumers. You know, the cost of the things we consume has come down dramatically over the last 4 or 5 decades. But I think it is fair to say that trade competition is one of the things that has contributed to a decline in manufacturing in the United States.
Today, those who have watched the integration of the global economy most closely warn that the genie of globalization, once let out of the bottle, would be impossible to put back in.
If the U.S. just suddenly tried to dramatically decouple from China by cutting off all supplies, it's not going to work. Nobody has the manufacturing capacity that China does today, and U.S. consumers are going to pay a very heavy price if we try to sever those ties.
Historically speaking, the supply chains were made cost-effective over time. It's a natural evolution, and it's not going to disappear.
As calls for the reshoring of key industries ramp up, experts warn that policymakers must proceed with caution.
We need to be careful and thoughtful about which sectors of the economy we would like to bring home to the United States.
I think it goes back to what are the things you couldn't live without? I think certainly medicine and medical supplies would be one of them. I certainly think food is one of them. And I think energy is also one of them.
With the memory of the acute shortages from the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic still fresh, many stakeholders insist that the U.S. government should use its national security powers to promote domestic manufacture of medical equipment.
We need a national strategic plan on that. I feel very strongly that, based on this experience, that there needs to be a renewed emphasis on domestic manufacturing, period. That is a vital interest to this country, and I would say is a national security interest.
We do have a precedent in the country for demanding that certain supply chains of critical material be made in the United States. So, for example, we don't manufacture weapon systems in other nations unless they're allies. We won't manufacture them in adversary nations. We won't buy them from adversaries. We've never defined medical equipment as a critical national security supply chain, but I think the pandemic has demonstrated that we have to rethink that.
The United States is one of the biggest producers of medical equipment in the world. The US, Germany, and Switzerland are the three biggest exporters in the world. The production comes from different places, depending on the product. Now, I think the problem is if everybody wants to manufacture everything domestically, that's simply not doable.
The pandemic has also raised questions about how reliably Americans can access vital medicines in a time of crisis.
The big concern is that some critical sort of key ingredients that go into certain patent medicines, and those ingredients are sourced on a bulk basis within China. As a result of perhaps trade friction, there's been some restriction in terms of the availability of these feedstocks from Chinese factories, and thus we're starting to see, for certain types of medicines, shortages at retail pharmacies.
It's not just the manufacturing of the products themselves, but it's actually the containers in which these products will be shipped to us, the glass vials, the syringes, etc., for which demand has clearly already outstripped supply. It's also really hard to make these products de novo and in short order.
But some experts warn that those who champion self-sufficiency should be mindful of the painful lessons learned by other countries that have tried to control their domestic food supplies.
I'll give you an example. Argentina wanted to protect its beef, and they didn't want their agricultural sector to be exporting beef and making all this money while locals could not find beef. The Argentine beef business is smaller. They are not producing to full capacity. It is less profitable. Some people are going out of business.
In the British case, one of the great pushes for national self-sufficiency after 1945 came in food. The United Kingdom was unique amongst the large countries in the world in that it imported something like half its food. Now, that was thought to be dangerous in the eyes of many people.
Playing a magnificent part in restocking our larders, New Zealand is going all out to send every possible ton of meat to Britain. Records are made and broken as the food drive goes on, and it isn't only meat. Thousands of tons of New Zealand butter and apples are also filling the holds.
Through protection, through investment, the output of food increased very dramatically, such that by the 1980s, the United Kingdom was essentially self-sufficient. So the result actually was that British people ended up eating relatively expensive food, and really only the sort of food that you could grow in this country. So I don't think it was especially good for the British diet that we had self-sufficiency in the 1970s and 1980s.
For economists and policymakers, the most concerning supply chains are those that feed high-tech manufacturing, a sector where countries around the world often rely on components produced in China.
The more challenging issue and the more difficult issue is not PPE or masks. It's sort of what to do with some of these, tech supply chains, Other high-end goods, things like electric vehicles, lithium-ion batteries, semiconductors, those are the products that also have a pretty globalized supply chain.
We've increasingly seen a convergence of commercial technologies and defense technologies and national security related technologies. We have huge vulnerabilities because of those dependencies on China.
Many experts worry that China's control over the supply of key minerals could put the U.S. at a disadvantage.
Exhibit A in that today would be rare earth materials, which are critical for pretty much every high technology application, from smartphones to electric cars to military applications of all sorts. China is the source of 80+% of the rare earth production in the world, not because rare earths are actually all that rare, but because the mining of them is very dirty and environmentally damaging, and the Chinese have been more willing to do this than other countries.
In 2010, they basically cut off our supplies of rare earths. That's a vulnerability that we have to address. These are the sorts of determinations that we have to make, partly at a political level, partly at an economic level, to determine how much we need to return to the United States.
American politicians from both parties have also tried to challenge China's dominance in the manufacture of solar panels.
This is for solar products, so that we'll be making solar products now, much more so in the United States. Our companies have been decimated, and those companies are going to be coming back strong.
But the parts that go into solar panels are produced by a complex global supply chain.
What we've witnessed in the United States since the tariffs have been implemented on solar panels is a corollary implication for a rise in cost for some of those domestic producers. The business of developing the solar industry here becomes very complex if you're not able to import low-cost products. One solar industry body actually posits that these tariffs, which have been implemented, have starved the U.S. industry of 62,000 jobs and $19 billion in capital.
We can argue on one hand, maybe it's not a good thing that we have all the solar panels being made in China. But on the other hand, unless we're able to replicate that scale and capacity in another country or in the United States, it's very hard to argue against the positive side of it, which is a huge drop in solar prices.
As trade tensions with China grow, experts debate to what extent concerns about China can be mitigated by diversifying supply chains to other countries.
China is no longer the lowest wage economy in the world, and so people have been moving factories out of China and into Vietnam, Bangladesh, the Philippines, Mexico, and so there has been a natural diversification as people move away from China. I think that's healthy.
You can expect to see a diversification of supply chains moving forward. But one thing I will say about China is that there are many companies that are still engaged in China and indeed even increasing their investments in Chinese manufacturing. But it's primarily because of the growth of the domestic Chinese consumer.
You may not be able to have your full supply chain in your country, but if you're going to have it in another country, you want it to be one where there is geographic proximity. So in our case, we'll probably have more supply chains closer in Mexico or in Canada when they can't be in the US.
The best answer is to diversify, is to have a supply chain that is all over the world, so that companies and governments don't depend on input that comes from one country or from one region.
With the most acute disruptions of the early COVID-19 pandemic in the rearview mirror, experts question whether the measures put in place to mitigate its effects might have enduring consequences for the world economy.
In the early phase of the pandemic, there was this huge scramble for medical supplies. Quite a large number of countries imposed some sorts of export restrictions on those. Those kinds of restrictions have largely faded away in terms of importance because we don't have this big shortage of medical supplies anymore.
There are restrictions that have been ongoing and intensifying even before COVID. And that may not change even when COVID is resolved.
Many countries already have restrictions on the export or even import of national security intensive goods or goods that are regarded as being important to national security. In the moment, they're a temporary expedience, but I think the experience of the pandemic is almost certainly going to lead many countries, including the United States, to try to impose more serious restrictions.
In a broader sense, the COVID-19 pandemic has magnified long-standing frustrations with an economy built on global trade.
What was happening before coronavirus was this move toward protectionism, move toward self-reliance, the tariff war, the trade war. And then on top of that came COVID. So that just added to the problems.
Free trade was in trouble before COVID. Many Americans and many people around the world were beginning to question the merits of free trade and whether free trade has indeed provided economic benefits to all members of its societies. But there is no doubt that COVID has accelerated concerns about free trade.
At a time when the benefits and drawbacks of trade have become a contentious part of the national political debate, some observers now wonder whether the era of free trade is over.
There's no question that the benefits of globalization are under fundamental attack. From the perspective here in the United States, we were winners for a long time. The last 30 years or so, relatively speaking, we've been the losers. Other countries are gaining more from trade than we are. I think what we're seeing is a partial turning inward, perhaps a correction from maybe a period in which we were over-globalized, somewhat too dependent on imports in a variety of different places.
Obviously, there's been a disillusionment with the most extreme manifestations of free trade, but I don't think that the American public is buying this. 95% of the world's consumers live outside the United States. If we're becoming more and more efficient in manufacturing goods with fewer workers, the only way we can expand jobs is to open markets around the world.
They say it's a matter of time, 1,000 days and the sun won't shine before I come back to you.
Analysts are eager to draw attention to the work behind the scenes that, despite the upheavals and uncertainties of the pandemic, has kept hospitals supplied and supermarkets stocked.
The U.S. supply chain for pharmaceutical-based products is unparalleled in the world. It is really the gold standard. Although the pandemic has stressed our system, it has remarkably held up very, very well to these stresses.
I will say that the private sector has done quite an amazing job to be able to get the supplies that we have today. And if you go to a grocery store, you'll see some out of stocks, but it is quite an accomplishment that you see the number of products that are there. And in order for those products to get there, there had to have been a tremendous amount of work and rework on a supply chain.
Around the world, consumers have become accustomed to the advantages of an economic system that has become astonishingly efficient. Cheaper goods, bigger selections, and faster delivery. But economic interdependence brings new risks. The hard-learned lessons of the COVID pandemic will loom large in the years to come as policymakers, economists, and business leaders work to prepare for the next great crisis.
Nothing's going to stop me. I'm making my way home. I'm making my way. I go solo. Oh, I go solo. I'm making my way home. I'm making my way.
Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on global affairs. Discussion groups meet online via Zoom and Google Meets, in person at community centers, libraries, places of worship, and homes across the country to discuss global issues with their community. Participants read the 8-topic briefing book, meet to discuss each topic, and complete a ballot which shares their views with Congress. To start or join a discussion group in your community, visit fpa.org or call 1-800-477-5836. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Herford Foundation, PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.